There are moments in a warrior's life that cannot be prepared for. Not because the warrior is weak, not because the warrior is unprepared, but because some encounters exist outside the boundaries of everything you have ever trained for, everything you have ever studied, everything you have ever believed about what combat is, and what a human body is capable of doing. Bruce Lee had one of these moments, and for the rest of his life, the tragically short remainder of it, he never fully spoke about what happened. Not in interviews, not in his journals, not in the late-night conversations with his closest students that have since been recorded and studied and analyzed by martial arts historians around the world. He kept it close. He kept it private. He kept it the way a man keeps the most transformative experience of his life. Not because he was ashamed, but because some things are too large for ordinary language. This is the story of the encounter that humbled Bruce Lee more completely than anything else in his life. The encounter that a 24-year-old martial arts prodigy, a man who had already defeated some of the most dangerous fighters on 2 continents, did not see coming. The encounter that changed the direction of Jeet Kune Do before Jeet Kune Do even had its name. Now, let me take you back to where it begins, because this story doesn't start with a fight. It starts with arrogance. And arrogance, as any honest warrior will tell you, is always the first thing that has to be destroyed before real learning can begin. Bruce Lee was 23 years old, and he was burning. Not with rage, not with desperation, with the specific, almost unbearable intensity of a young man who has discovered something true about himself and cannot yet find the limits of it. He had been training since he was 13, a decade of Wing Chun under the legendary IP Man, years of boxing study, wrestling research, the obsessive cross-examination of every fighting system he encountered. He had fought in the streets of Hong Kong as a teenager, real fights, dangerous fights, the kind that carry legal consequences and physical scars. He had won. Not always cleanly, not always without cost, but he had won enough, and with enough consistency, and against enough people who genuinely wanted to hurt him, that a picture had formed in his mind. A picture of what he was capable of, and where he stood in relation to the martial arts world around him. That picture, he was about to discover, was incomplete. Hong Kong in 1963 was a city caught between worlds, British colonial administration pressing down from above, traditional Chinese culture pressing up from below, and the energy of a population that had survived war and displacement and poverty, creating a street-level intensity that you could feel in the air like static electricity before a storm. The martial arts world existed within this pressure cooker, and it had its own hierarchy, its own politics, its own ancient grudges and alliances. Bruce Lee occupied an unusual position in this world. On one hand, he was legitimately gifted. Even the most skeptical traditional masters acknowledged his speed and his physical conditioning. On the other hand, he was already showing signs of the philosophical independence that would eventually make him legendary. He questioned. He challenged. He refused to accept technique on the basis of tradition alone. He wanted to know, does this work? How do we know it works? Have you tested it under conditions where failure was genuinely possible? These were not comfortable questions in a world built on unquestioned lineage. His teacher, IP Man, had watched this quality in his student with a mixture of pride and concern. Pride because intellectual courage is the foundation of genuine martial development. Concern because intellectual courage, without the wisdom to temper it, has a way of walking its possessor into rooms they are not yet ready to be in. IP Man had tried to warn him. Bruce Lee, at 23, brilliant and burning and certain, had not fully listened, and then one evening, a message arrived. An invitation from a man whose name, when spoken in the right circles of Hong Kong's martial arts community, caused a specific kind of silence. Here is where the historical record becomes deliberately obscured. The identities of people involved in private martial arts encounters from this era were rarely documented. Traditional masters operated in a world where reputation was everything and discretion was non-negotiable. Challenges were issued and met behind closed doors. Outcomes were whispered rather than published. The winner's identity was sometimes kept as secret as the loser's. What we know, assembled from the accounts of people who were present, from references in the private communications of Bruce Lee's closest associates, from the oral traditions of Hong Kong's martial arts community, is this: the man who invited Bruce Lee to visit was old. Old in a way that Hong Kong's martial arts world classified separately from merely elderly. He had been training since before Bruce Lee's parents were born. He had studied at institutions and under lineages that, by 1963, had almost entirely ceased to exist. He carried in his body the accumulated technical knowledge of a tradition that was in the process of dying out, not because it had been defeated, but because the world that had produced it was disappearing. He lived simply. A small space in one of Hong Kong's older districts. A few students, carefully chosen, deeply trusted. He did not advertise. He did not compete. He did not give interviews or seek recognition. He trained because training was what he was. He breathed and he trained, and occasionally, very occasionally, he agreed to meet someone whose potential seemed worth his time. He had heard about the young man who was beginning to make noise in Hong Kong's martial arts circles. The young man with the impossible speed and the uncomfortable questions. The young man who had studied under IP Man and then kept going. Kept studying, kept questioning. He was curious. He sent word, Bruce Lee. When he received the invitation, felt something he would later describe to a close friend as a premonition. Not fear exactly. Something quieter and more unsettling than fear. The instinct of a genuinely gifted young fighter, that he was about to encounter something he didn't have a category for yet. He went anyway. Because Bruce Lee always went. That was who he was. What happened when he arrived would stay with him for the rest of his life. The space was small. Smaller than Bruce Lee expected. No elaborate training equipment. No rows of students in uniform. No display of trophies or photographs or the visual apparatus of institutional authority. Just a wooden floor, worn smooth by what must have been thousands of hours of bare feet moving across it. A few simple training implements along one wall. Natural light from a single window. And in the center of this space, an old man. Bruce Lee would later tell people that his first reaction, the honest, unfiltered, completely involuntary first reaction that his body produced before his mind could intervene, was doubt, not of the old man, of himself, because there was something in the way the old man occupied the room that Bruce Lee had never encountered before in quite this form. It wasn't size. It wasn't the visual vocabulary of physical danger. It was something structural, something about the relationship between the old man's body and the space around it, that communicated information Bruce Lee's training hadn't given him a language for yet. He looked. Bruce Lee would later say, like someone who had nowhere to be except exactly where he was. Like a man for whom the concept of hurrying had become not just unnecessary, but literally meaningless. Like someone who had been standing in the center of rooms like this one, for so long that the room had simply organized itself around him. They exchanged the formal courtesies, appropriate to the occasion. The old man's movements, even in simple social gesture, had a quality that Bruce Lee would spend years trying to describe. Economy. Not the economy of someone conserving energy, but the economy of someone who had so thoroughly eliminated unnecessary movement from every level of their existence that what remained was functionally indistinguishable from stillness, even when they were in motion. Tea was brought. They sat. They talked. The old man asked questions. Not about techniques or training regimens or the specifics of Bruce Lee's martial arts background. He asked about other things. About what Bruce Lee was trying to understand. About what questions he was living inside. About what he believed the purpose of martial training ultimately was. Bruce Lee answered. Articulately, passionately, with the organized certainty of a young man who has thought carefully about something and arrived at conclusions he is confident in. The old man listened. Said very little. Occasionally asked a question that revealed, in the most quiet possible way, that Bruce Lee's confident answers had not quite addressed what the question was actually asking. This continued for perhaps an hour. Then the old man set down his tea, looked at Bruce Lee with an expression that witnesses would later struggle to characterize, not unkind, not challenging, not condescending, but carrying an almost unbearable quality of patience, and said something that has been translated and retranslated by people who were told about it secondhand. The most accurate translation seems to be approximately this: "You know a great deal. Now let me show you what you don't know yet." He rose from his seat, and Bruce Lee, who had been in hundreds of training sessions and dozens of real fights, and who prided himself on his ability to read a situation accurately, felt something shift in the room that he did not have an explanation for. Something was about to happen, something he was not ready for. What happened next has been described by people who heard it from Bruce Lee directly, and by people who heard it from those people, with enough consistency that the core of it seems reliable, even across the distortions of retelling. The old man asked Bruce Lee to attack him, not to spar, not to engage in a technical exchange, to attack with genuine intention, genuine commitment, genuine speed. Bruce Lee attacked. What happened to that attack is the part of the story that causes even experienced martial artists to go quiet when they hear it. The attack, fast, committed, technically precise in the way that only someone of Bruce Lee's caliber could produce, did not land. This was not itself remarkable. Many skilled practitioners could avoid Bruce Lee's attacks with sufficient warning and distance. What was remarkable was the specific quality of how it didn't land. There was no dramatic evasion, no athletic leap backward, no sweeping parry. The old man appeared, to the witnesses present, to barely move at all. And yet somehow Bruce Lee's attack, complete, genuine, launched with the full intention of landing, arrived in a place that was no longer occupied. The old man was elsewhere. Not far elsewhere. Inches elsewhere. But the inches were somehow always exactly the right ones. Bruce Lee attacked again. And again. Each time with increasing commitment, increasing speed, accessing levels of his ability that he did not routinely deploy because they were not routinely necessary. Each time, the same result. The attack arrived. The old man was not there. And here is the detail that martial artists who have heard this story focus on most intently. The old man's face did not change. He was not working. He was not straining. He was not exerting anything that observers could identify as effort. He moved when he moved at all, with the same unhurried, apparently effortless quality that had characterized his movements. Pouring tea. As if avoiding Bruce Lee's attacks was not a different category of activity from anything else he did. As if this was simply how he existed in space. Bruce Lee stopped. This itself was remarkable. Bruce Lee did not stop. Bruce Lee was constitutionally incapable of stopping in the face of a challenge. His entire psychology was built around the principle of continuing until the answer revealed itself. He stopped. He stood. He looked at the old man. And then, by the account of at least two people who heard this from Bruce Lee directly, he said something that he almost never said to anyone. "I don't understand what you just did." The old man nodded. This, his expression suggested, was the correct response. This was the beginning of something. "Now," he said, "we can start." What followed? according to the accounts that have been assembled from Bruce Lee's own references to the experience, lasted approximately 3 days, not 3 days of formal instruction. Not 3 days of technique transmission in the structured sense that martial arts training usually implies. 3 days of something more difficult to categorize, a sustained encounter between a young man's existing understanding of what martial arts was and an old man's embodied demonstration of what it could be. The specific techniques involved have never been fully documented. Bruce Lee was characteristically private about the technical specifics of encounters that genuinely affected him. What he shared in the fragmentary references that researchers have assembled were impressions rather than mechanics, descriptions of principles rather than methods. What has been reconstructed from these fragments suggests that the old man's approach operated on at least 3 levels that Bruce Lee had not previously encountered, integrated in a single practitioner. The first was what we might call perceptual speed, the ability to process incoming information faster than conscious decision-making ordinarily allows. This is not the same as physical speed. A physically fast practitioner reacts quickly once they have registered what they are reacting to. What the old man appeared to possess was a compression of the time between stimulus and recognition that bypassed ordinary conscious processing entirely. He didn't respond to attacks faster than Bruce Lee could attack. He appeared, somehow, to already be responding before the attack fully declared itself. Bruce Lee had studied and written about this concept from a theoretical perspective, the idea of preemptive response, of reading intention rather than action. What the old man showed him was what it looked like when this concept had been developed to a level that Bruce Lee had not previously witnessed in actual application. The second level was what Bruce Lee would later describe in references that his students have interpreted over the decades since as structural efficiency so complete that it became functionally invisible. Every martial arts practitioner understands the concept of efficiency, removing unnecessary movement, directing force along optimal pathways, using the body's structure to generate and absorb power. The old man appeared to have taken this concept so far that his body had essentially stopped having a neutral state. Every position it occupied was already optimally prepared for whatever came next. There was no transition cost, no moment of reorganization between what he was doing and what he needed to do. This is the kind of efficiency that Bruce Lee had been pursuing his entire training life. He had achieved levels of it that astonished other practitioners. What the old man showed him was that the ceiling he had assumed existed, the ceiling that defined the upper limits of what this concept could produce, was not where he had placed it. The third level is the most difficult to describe and has generated the most debate among the people who have studied this period of Bruce Lee's development. It relates to something that exists at the intersection of psychological and physical preparation, a quality of presence in the combat environment that the old man appeared to possess, and that made the combat environment itself behave differently around him. Bruce Lee's students have described this quality using various language over the years. Some have called it threat neutralization at the source. The old man apparently possessed the ability to not generate the kind of openings that skilled fighters exploit, not through defensive technique, but through a quality of wholeness in his positioning that simply didn't produce the gaps that attacks require. Others have described it in terms borrowed from Bruce Lee's philosophical writings as something close to the Zen concept of mushin, no mind, but extended and developed and embodied, to a degree that moved it from philosophy into something more like a different relationship with physical reality itself. What is consistent across all these descriptions is Bruce Lee's own response to it. He was by every account genuinely humbled, not embarrassed, not defeated in the sense that defeat implies failure, but brought to the edge of his understanding and shown, with complete clarity, that the edge was not where he had thought it was. For a man of Bruce Lee's extraordinary confidence, justified, hard-earned, tested confidence, this experience was seismic. On the third day, according to the account that has been most carefully preserved, the old man and Bruce Lee sat again. Same tea, same small room. Different atmosphere. The silence between them now held a different quality. The silence of two people who have been through something together, rather than the silence of two people who have not yet established what they are to each other. The old man spoke. What he said, reconstructed across multiple retellings and inevitably imperfect in translation, concerned the nature of what Bruce Lee had spent a decade building. He acknowledged the young man's gifts without flattery. He acknowledged the genuine innovation in his approach, the intellectual courage of his questioning, the physical achievements that were, by any standard, remarkable. And then he said something that Bruce Lee would return to in various forms for the rest of his life. He said, approximately, the danger of understanding something true is believing you have understood everything true. He was not criticizing Jeet Kune Do. He was not defending traditional forms against Bruce Lee's challenges to them. He was pointing at something more fundamental, the way that genuine insight, genuine discovery, genuine progress can create a new ceiling just as surely as the old ceiling it replaced. The way that the man who escapes one limitation often builds his new freedom into a new prison, slightly larger than the old one, but a prison nonetheless. Bruce Lee, the old man suggested, had escaped many cages. His questioning mind, his refusal to accept technique on the basis of tradition alone, his insistence on testing everything under realistic conditions. These had produced genuine liberation from the limitations that trapped most martial artists. But liberation from one thing is not the same as complete freedom. And the young man's certainty, the absolute, fire-bright certainty that his approach was correct, that he had found the essential truth about how combat worked and what a martial artist should be, that certainty was itself a cage, smaller than the ones he had escaped, more comfortable, but a cage nonetheless. The old man's demonstration over 3 days had not been a refutation of Bruce Lee's methods. It had been an extension of them, a demonstration of what those methods led to if you followed them further than Bruce Lee had yet followed them. If you refused to stop where comfort and current understanding suggested stopping. If you kept asking the questions that Bruce Lee himself said should never stop being asked, you never arrive, the old man said. The fighter who believes he has arrived has already begun to diminish. Bruce Lee sat with this for a long time. When he finally spoke, he asked a question that the old man apparently found significant enough to remember, because it was repeated years later to people who recorded it. He asked, how long? How long had the old man been training to reach this? How long before the principles Bruce Lee had encountered over 3 days became something a practitioner could actually rely on? The old man's answer, in the most faithful translation available, longer than you want to hear. But every day of it was the practice itself, not the preparation for the practice. The practice. Bruce Lee left that small room in Hong Kong's older districts and walked back into a world that looked the same as it had 3 days before. Same streets, same sounds, same faces. The city continuing its relentless, pressurized forward motion, without any awareness that one of the people moving through it had just had their understanding of reality structurally renovated. He was, by all accounts from people who knew him in this period, quieter for some time afterward. Not withdrawn. Bruce Lee was constitutionally incapable of withdrawal, but quieter in a specific way, as if the processing required by what he had experienced was occupying bandwidth that would normally have been available for outward expression. His training changed. Not dramatically, The changes were subtle enough that only his closest students and training partners noticed them. But they noticed. There was a shift in what he prioritized in his own training sessions. A greater emphasis on what one student described as the spaces between techniques, the quality of readiness that exists not in any specific position, but in the transition between positions. A deeper attention to the perceptual aspects of combat preparation rather than purely the physical and technical. His philosophical writing changed too. The journals from this period show a more careful attention to what Bruce Lee himself called the danger of conclusion, the moment when inquiry stops and certainty begins. His famous formulations about the need to be like water, to have no fixed form, to be free of style. These concepts existed in embryonic form before the encounter with the old master. But the journals show them deepening and clarifying in the months that followed. He told almost no one directly what had happened. The few people who received any direct account describe him as uncharacteristically reluctant to discuss details. He would acknowledge that he had encountered someone remarkable. He would acknowledge that the encounter had been educational in ways he was still processing. Beyond that, he kept the specific experience close. Why? The people who knew him best have offered various interpretations over the years. Some believe he was protecting the old master's privacy, respecting the tradition of discretion that governed private martial arts encounters in that world. Some believe he was protecting his own developing understanding, not wanting to fix it in language, before it had fully resolved into something he could trust. Some believe the experience was simply too fundamental to reduce to the kind of explanatory narrative that interviews and conversations demand. But there is another possibility that some researchers have suggested. A possibility that says something important about who Bruce Lee actually was. Perhaps he kept it private because it was the most important thing that had ever happened to him. And the most important things, the things that genuinely change the structure of your understanding rather than just adding to it, are not improved by being turned into stories. They are improved by being lived. You can trace the influence of those 3 days in Hong Kong through everything Bruce Lee built in the decade that followed. Jeet Kune Do, as it was formalized, taught, and transmitted to the students who carried it forward, contains at its philosophical core a principle that is unusual in martial arts history: the explicit, built-in instruction to transcend itself. Bruce Lee designed his own system with the instruction that practitioners should eventually leave it behind. Not abandon it carelessly, but outgrow it the way a person outgrows any tool that has served its purpose, with gratitude and without clinging. This is not a typical martial arts philosophy. Most systems are designed to be permanent. Most lineages are built on the assumption that what the founder created represents an endpoint, a sufficient answer, a truth complete enough to organize a lifetime around. Bruce Lee built something designed to be outgrown. Where did this come from? His students have debated this question for decades. His philosophical reading, Krishnamurti, Alan Watts, the Zen literature he absorbed obsessively, certainly contributed. His own restless, questioning intelligence certainly contributed. His early experiences of encountering the limits of Wing Chun and choosing expansion over tradition certainly contributed, but many of his closest students, when they speak carefully about the sources of Jeet Kune Do's most unusual philosophical characteristics, return to this period, to the encounter in Hong Kong, to the 3 days in a small room with an old man who had been doing what Bruce Lee was doing. Just further along a road Bruce Lee had barely started down. The encounter showed him the horizon, not the destination. The old man had been explicit that there was no destination, but the horizon, the evidence that the road went further than he had seen, the living proof that the principles he was pursuing were real and productive and capable of producing results that he himself had not yet achieved. This is one of the most important things that can happen to a young person of genuine ability. encountering someone further along the same road they are on. Not someone on a different road, not someone offering a different answer to the same questions, but someone who has been asking the same questions longer and has more of the answers and is willing to show you, for a limited time, what that looks like. Bruce Lee was fortunate enough to have this experience before the certainty of his own gifts calcified into the arrogance that kills development in gifted people. The old man in Hong Kong broke something open that might otherwise have closed, and from that opening came everything. In the years since Bruce Lee's death, martial arts researchers and historians have attempted to identify the old man. Some believe they have found him. Most of these identifications remain disputed. What is less disputed is the tradition he likely represented, the specific qualities of his approach, the perceptual speed, the structural efficiency, the quality of presence that seemed to reshape the combat environment around him, are consistent with certain branches of internal Chinese martial arts that were, by the early 1960s, in severe decline. The political catastrophes of the 20th century had been devastating for these traditions. War, displacement, revolution, the conditions that allow rare knowledge to be transmitted carefully across generations had been systematically destroyed. The practitioners who carried the deepest levels of these arts were old, scattered, often unwilling to teach publicly in a world that had become unsafe for the kind of patience that real transmission requires. The old man Bruce Lee encountered in 1963 was almost certainly one of a very small number of people alive at that time who still embodied these traditions at their highest levels. What he possessed was not magic. It was not mysticism. It was the product of decades of practice in a system that had been refined over centuries, specifically to develop the qualities he demonstrated: perceptual speed, structural efficiency, absolute economy of movement, to their ultimate expression. Bruce Lee understood this. His response to the encounter was not mystified awe but the response of a scientist encountering phenomena his current models cannot explain: intense curiosity, immediate revision of assumptions, and a commitment to understanding that would shape his work for the rest of his life. He began studying the internal arts more seriously. Not to adopt them, that was not his way, but to understand the principles they had developed that his own approach had not yet fully integrated. To extract what was true from what was merely traditional. To add to what he was building. This was Jeet Kune Do in practice, the living system that absorbs what works regardless of where it comes from and discards everything else. The old master had shown him an entire category of what works that he hadn't previously encountered. Bruce Lee died on July 20th, 1973. He was 32 years old. 10 years after those 3 days in Hong Kong. A decade of work so concentrated and so productive that its influence has continued to expand in every year since. With no sign of stopping, the old master, whatever his name, whatever his tradition, almost certainly died sometime in the years around this period, if he had not died already. The trail goes cold the way these trails always go cold. A man who spent his life avoiding documentation leaves very little for researchers to find. What remains is the echo in Jeet Kune Do's philosophical architecture. The echo in the specific qualities Bruce Lee's students describe when they talk about the aspects of his teaching that surprised them most. The emphasis on perceptual development, the attention to what exists between techniques, the insistence that the system was a means rather than an end, the echo in the particular humility that everyone who trains seriously with Bruce Lee noticed beneath the extraordinary confidence, a humility that seemed to come from direct experience of how far the road went, rather than from any theoretical commitment to modesty. And there is another echo, perhaps the most important one, Bruce Lee passed the encounter on. Not as a story, he was too private for that. Not as a technique, the encounter had not been about techniques, but as a quality of expectation, as an insistence built into everything he taught, that his students should expect to be humbled, should expect to encounter people and experiences that revealed the limitations of their current understanding, should understand that this revelation, when it came, was not defeat, but the most important form of education available. He built the expectation of humbling into the structure of what he created, because he had been humbled. Genuinely, completely, indelibly humbled. By an old man in a small room in Hong Kong who had spent decades walking. Further down the same road Bruce Lee had just begun. He knew, with the certainty of direct experience rather than mere belief, that the humbling had been the most important thing that had ever happened to him. More important than any victory. More important than any film. More important than any philosophical insight arrived at in isolation. The old master's gift was not technique. It was not even wisdom. Exactly. It was the gift of the horizon. The proof that the road went further. The demonstration that what Bruce Lee had achieved, remarkable as it was not the ceiling. That the ceiling was higher than he could currently see. That the journey was longer and richer and more demanding and more rewarding than his current map showed. This is the most valuable thing one person can give another. This is what the ancient Shaolin master gave Bruce Lee, and Bruce Lee, for the decade he had left, gave it to everyone he taught. The most humbling defeat of his life became the foundation of everything he built. That is not a defeat. That is what defeat becomes. In the hands of someone great enough to receive it correctly. Somewhere in Hong Kong. In the early 1960s. In a small room with a worn wooden floor and a single window. A conversation happened. An old man and a young man. Tea getting cold on a low table. The sound of the city continuing outside. Indifferent. The old man showed the young man the horizon. The young man spent the rest of his life walking toward it. He never arrived. No one ever arrives. The old man had told him this, and he had understood it, not just intellectually but in his body. In the direct and irreplaceable way that 3 days of honest encounter with someone further along the road produces understanding. The road has no end. This is not a tragedy. This is the gift. The martial artist who understands that the road has no end trains differently from the one who believes he is approaching a destination. He trains with the specific sustainable patience of someone who has accepted that the journey is the point. That every day of practice is not preparation for something else, but the thing itself. That humbling, when it comes, is not failure but invitation. Bruce Lee understood this. The ancient Shaolin master showed him, and somewhere in every dojo, where Jeet Kune Do is still practiced. In every gym where Bruce Lee's principles have been absorbed into the methodology without attribution. In every fighter who has been taught that no style is complete, and that honest testing is the only valid teacher. Somewhere in all of this, the old man's lesson is still moving through the world, still walking, still showing people the horizon, still reminding anyone humble enough to listen that the ceiling is higher than you think. The road is longer than your map, and the most valuable thing that can happen to you is the encounter that shows you how much you don't know yet.